Part 1. Origins and Society. Geographic and chronological context. The Vikings emerged from Scandinavia, present-day Norway, Sweden and Denmark, during the late 8th century, specifically around 750 to 800 CE. However, this emergence was not sudden or disconnected from preceding centuries. Norse communities had inhabited northern Europe for millennia, developing gradually from earlier Germanic and Indo-European populations. What changed during the late 8th century was not the existence of these peoples, but their expansion beyond Scandinavian borders and their impact on surrounding regions. The term Viking itself requires clarification. Scholars debate its precise etymology, with possibilities including Old Norse vikinga, potentially meaning pirate, or one who frequents inlets. Importantly, Viking was not a unified ethnic or national identity. Rather, it described individuals engaged in maritime raiding and commerce, a profession or activity rather than an ethnicity. Scandinavian peoples included distinct groups: Norwegians, Swedes, Danes, and smaller populations with regional identities. These groups did not identify as a collective Viking nation, but as separate kingdoms with competing interests and distinct cultural characteristics. The chronological period termed the Viking Age conventionally spans from approximately 793 CE, the Lindisfarne raid, to 1066 CE, though these boundaries represent scholarly convention rather than precise historical transformation. Scandinavian expansion and contact with surrounding regions occurred before and continued after these dates. Understanding Vikings requires recognizing this as a period of transition and intensified contact rather than a discrete historical epoch with absolute beginning and ending points. Environmental and geographic factors. Scandinavia's geography fundamentally shaped Norse society and expansion patterns. The region comprises mountainous terrain, interspersed with fjords, coastal areas, and river systems. Dense forests covered much of the landscape, while glaciated mountains dominated the eastern regions. This geography provided access to abundant timber and marine resources, but limited extensive agricultural development. Arable land was scarce and unevenly distributed, concentrating wealth and power among those controlling productive territories. The climate during the Viking Age was variable but generally favorable for agriculture compared to surrounding periods. The medieval warm period, spanning approximately 950 to 1250 CE, provided extended growing seasons and reduced sea ice in northern waters. This climatic advantage enabled population growth and increased maritime activity. Conversely, cooler periods, particularly toward the end of the Viking Age, restricted agricultural yields and motivated continued or renewed expansion. Water systems, coastal access, fjords, and river networks proved transformative in Norse development. Unlike terrestrial geography, which imposed significant limitations, water provided highways for transportation and communication. Rivers penetrated deep into continental interiors, enabling Norse traders and raiders to access wealthy interior regions. This geographic reality directly influenced the form Norse expansion took: maritime, river-based penetration rather than territorial conquest of inland areas. Scandinavian isolation from Mediterranean and European centers during earlier medieval periods meant Norse communities developed relatively independently. However, they maintained contact with other northern European peoples through trade and cultural exchange. Irish monks reached Iceland, Byzantine merchants connected with Eastern European tribes, and Germanic peoples interacted with Scandinavian populations. By the 8th century, Norse societies were not isolated populations, but integrated, if peripherally, into broader European networks. Social hierarchy and class structure. Scandinavian society during the Viking Age was rigidly hierarchical, divided into distinct social classes with limited vertical mobility. At the apex stood the kings and jarls, regional rulers, and nobility. These individuals controlled land, commanded military forces, and wielded political authority. Kings were not absolute monarchs in the later European sense, but rather powerful chieftains whose authority derived from military strength, wealth, and often perceived divine favor or ancestral legitimacy. Below the aristocracy existed the carls, free farmers, craftspeople, merchants, and warriors. This class constituted the bulk of the population and included individuals with varying degrees of wealth and influence. A wealthy carl's merchant could accumulate significant riches through trade, while a subsistence farmer lived precariously. Within this class existed further distinctions: those who owned land versus those who rented, those with military training versus those without. Despite these internal variations, all carls shared the fundamental characteristic of legal freedom and the theoretical right to own property. Beneath the free classes existed thralls, enslaved people whose status was hereditary and permanent unless manumitted. Thralls represented a substantial portion of Viking societies, possibly 10 to 30% of the population in some communities, though estimates vary considerably. They were property, owned by individuals or institutions, and their labor formed the economic foundation of many wealthy households. Thralls performed agricultural work, domestic service, craft production, and other labor-intensive tasks. They could be bought, sold, inherited, or gifted like other property. The acquisition of thralls occurred through multiple channels. Raiding constituted one source, with captives enslaved and retained or sold. Purchase represented another significant avenue, with established slave markets operating throughout Scandinavia and accessible through trade connections. Internal debt slavery also occurred, with individuals incapable of repaying debts entering servitude. Some thralls were born into slavery, inheriting servile status from enslaved parents. The condition of thralls varied. Some lived relatively well in wealthy households with multiple slaves, while others faced harsh treatment and brief lifespans. This variation was not systematic, but dependent on individual masters and circumstances. Archaeological evidence from burial sites reveals social hierarchy through grave goods. Elite burials contained weapons, ornaments, and luxury items indicating high status, while common burials contained simpler grave goods or none. Some burials include ships or boats, particularly in coastal Scandinavia, suggesting ritual significance and expenditure indicating wealth. The presence of multiple skeletons in single burials sometimes suggests human sacrifice or ritualistic killing, potentially of slaves or captives, though interpretations remain debated among scholars. Women occupied a distinctive position within Norse society. Unlike many medieval European societies, Norse women possessed considerable legal rights. They could own property independently, initiate divorce proceedings, manage households and businesses, and inherit wealth. Archaeological evidence of female burials containing weapons suggests some women participated in warfare, though whether as regular warriors or in exceptional circumstances remains unclear. Some sources reference shield maidens, female warriors, though historical evidence for organized female military units is limited. Widows wielded particular authority, managing estates and family interests in husbands' absence. Conversely, women were still subordinated to male authority structures, and their rights, while significant, operated within patriarchal frameworks. Technological advancement and maritime knowledge. Norse maritime technology represented a significant advancement over contemporary European vessels. The longship, developed through centuries of shipbuilding evolution, featured distinctive characteristics, enabling unprecedented range and versatility. These vessels possess shallow drafts, allowing navigation of both open oceans and shallow rivers, critical for penetrating inland European territories. The symmetrical bow and stern design permitted rapid reversals of direction without difficult turning maneuvers. Open construction, without extensive decking, enabled crew flexibility and cargo adaptation. Construction techniques utilized overlapping planks, clinker construction, providing strength while maintaining flexibility in water. Oak timber provided durability, while tar and animal hair caulking created watertight seams. Norse shipwrights possessed sophisticated understanding of wood properties, selecting appropriate timber for specific purposes and understanding stress distribution throughout vessels. The quality of surviving ship remains, such as the Gokstad ship, a 9th century vessel preserving structural integrity, demonstrates advanced engineering knowledge. However, technological superiority should not be exaggerated. Longships were not magical vessels enabling Vikings to overcome any opposition. They were well-designed craft suited to specific conditions, northern waters and riverine navigation. In Mediterranean contexts or open oceans beyond northern latitudes, other ship designs proved equally or more effective. Byzantine, Arab and Irish vessels matched or exceeded Norse capabilities in different contexts. Norse success derived not from absolute technological superiority, but from appropriate technology applied to specific geographic advantages. Navigation techniques remain partially obscure, as Vikings left limited written records of navigational methodology. Evidence suggests they utilized astronomical observation, particularly solar positioning and star navigation. Some researchers propose the existence of sunstones, crystals with light polarizing properties enabling navigation under cloudy conditions, though archaeological evidence remains contentious. More certainly, Vikings employed experiential knowledge of currents, weather patterns, and seasonal conditions accumulated over generations. They followed established routes passed through oral tradition and practical observation. Economic organization and trade networks. Viking economies combined subsistence agriculture with trade and, for some, raiding activities. The majority of Norse people were farmers, managing modest holdings, producing grain, root vegetables, and dairy products while maintaining livestock. Agricultural surplus supported non-farming populations, craftspeople, warriors, merchants, and rulers. The significance of agriculture in sustaining Norse societies contradicts romantic images emphasizing exclusively raiding or maritime activity. Trade represented another crucial economic activity. Norse merchants established commercial networks extending across Europe and into Asia. Swedish traders, particularly, penetrated Russian waterway systems, establishing trading posts and developing routes connecting Scandinavia with Constantinople and the Islamic world. These were not temporary incursions, but sustained commercial relationships involving permanent settlements, continuous merchant activity, and institutional development. Goods flowed in multiple directions across these networks. Scandinavia exported furs, particularly valuable in warmer climates, amber from Baltic sources, walrus ivory, dried fish, and iron products. In return, Norse merchants imported silk, spices, precious metals, wine, and luxury goods. This exchange was not exploitation in a modern economic sense, but reciprocal trade benefiting participating communities. Scandinavian merchants operated as participants in established commercial systems, rather than external invaders imposing themselves through force. Coinage adoption occurred gradually during the Viking Age. Scandinavian societies initially used silver by weight for transactions, with merchants carrying scales to measure appropriate quantities. Gradually, as contact with coin-using societies increased, Scandinavian rulers began minting coins, primarily in major trading centers. This monetary development reflected integration into broader European economic systems rather than internal innovation. Religious beliefs and spiritual practice. Pre-Christian Norse religion centered on polytheistic belief systems venerating multiple deities. Principal gods included Odin, associated with wisdom, war, and death, Thor, god of thunder and strength, and Freya, goddess of fertility and love. However, these beliefs were not monolithic or unchanging. Regional variations existed, some communities emphasized different deities, and beliefs evolved over time. Archaeological and textual evidence suggests religious practices varied significantly among different Norse populations and periods. The concept of Valhalla, a warrior paradise for those dying in battle, features prominently in popular Viking imagery. However, historical evidence suggests this belief, while present, was likely less central to religious practice than modern representations suggest. Most Norse individuals, including many warriors, likely prioritized prosperous, stable lives with families and communities rather than glorious battlefield deaths. The emphasis on martial valor in surviving sources, primarily sagas and poems composed by and for aristocratic audiences, may overrepresent warfare's cultural significance compared to agricultural or domestic concerns dominating most people's lives. Religious practice included ritualistic elements reflected in archaeological evidence. Burial practices, sometimes involving ship interments, grave goods, and possibly human sacrifice, suggest ritual sophistication. Place names and landscape features indicate sacred locations where religious ceremonies occurred. However, detailed knowledge of religious practice remains limited, as written records from pre-Christian Scandinavia are scarce, and later Christian accounts describing pagan practices were often hostile or distorting. Christianization occurred gradually during the Viking Age, beginning in the 10th century and largely completing by the 12th century. This was not instantaneous religious conversion imposed by external force, but prolonged adaptation, involving both conscious choices and pragmatic political calculation. Kings adopted Christianity partly for spiritual conviction, but also for political advantages, connections with Christian European kingdoms, acceptance within Christian diplomatic frameworks, and the prestige associated with Christian rulership. Common populations converted more slowly, with many communities maintaining pre-Christian practices alongside Christianity for extended periods, a phenomenon termed religious syncretism. Cultural identity and oral tradition. Norse cultures maintained strong oral traditions, with skalds, professional poets and storytellers, preserving historical accounts, genealogies, and cultural narratives through memorized verse and performance. This oral tradition represented sophisticated mnemonic system, transmitting complex information across generations before writing became widespread in Scandinavia. Skalds served aristocratic patrons, composing praise poetry and recording significant events through poetic composition following strict metrical and alliterative rules. Archaeological material culture, weapons, jewelry, household items and artistic productions reveals aesthetic values and technical sophistication. Norse craftspeople produced intricate metalwork, detailed wood carvings, and decorative items demonstrating high artistic standards and technical skill. The distinctive Norse artistic style, incorporating zoomorphic designs and interlocking patterns, created visually distinctive artifacts separating Norse production from contemporary European or Mediterranean craftsmanship. Identity formation in Norse societies operated through kinship, geography, and shared cultural practices. Individual identity derived primarily from family connections and clan associations, rather than broader national categories. Loyalty operated through networks of reciprocal obligation, connecting individuals, families, and communities. This social organization, based on kinship and personal loyalty rather than institutional bureaucracy, influenced how Norse societies expanded and integrated new territories through settlement and gradual cultural blending rather than centralized administrative control. Pre-expansion context. Understanding Viking Age origins requires recognizing Norse societies as complex communities with sophisticated social structures, economic systems, and cultural traditions. These were not primitive or barbaric peoples emerging suddenly to terrorize Europe. Rather, they were Scandinavian populations possessing advanced maritime technology, developed trade networks, and hierarchical social organization. Environmental factors, geography and climate, combined with technological capabilities and economic incentives to position Scandinavian populations for expansion during the late 8th century. The Viking Age represents not a sudden appearance of new peoples, but the intensification and wider impact of processes already operating within Northern European societies. Part 2. Expansion and Raids, 793–950 CE. The Lindisfarne Raid and Initial Contact. The raid on Lindisfarne Monastery in northeastern England on June 8, 793 CE marked the documented beginning of Viking expansion into Western Europe. The attack on this defenseless religious community shocked Christian contemporaries and prompted extensive written response from shocked monastic chroniclers. However, it is critical to understand this event in proper context. rather than as the arbitrary beginning of organized Viking conquest. Lindisfarne represented an exceptionally vulnerable target. The monastery housed valuable religious artifacts, precious metals, and portable wealth accumulated through centuries of Christian donation and patronage. Its island location provided limited defensive capability, and its inhabitants, monks dedicated to religious contemplation, possessed neither military training nor significant defensive fortifications. From a purely practical standpoint, a small Norse raiding party could anticipate significant material gain with minimal opposition. The monastery's prominence in contemporary written records has created a historiographical distortion. Christian monks, the primary literate individuals in medieval Europe, recorded attacks on their communities extensively and emotionally. These written accounts emphasized violence, destruction, and religious desecration, understandably traumatic experiences for the victims. Simultaneously, these same monastic chroniclers largely ignored equivalent violence perpetrated by Christian military forces, Viking or otherwise. Charlemagne's campaigns against Saxons resulted in mass casualties and forced religious conversion. European nobles conducted destructive warfare against each other continuously. Yet these events received far less dramatic chronicling than Viking attacks. The literary emphasis on Lindisfarne and subsequent monastic raids has created a distorted historical narrative, emphasizing Viking violence disproportionately. This does not negate the reality of monastery attacks or their destructive impact. Rather, it contextualizes these attacks within broader patterns of medieval violence while recognizing that monastic documentation privileged its own experiences in historical record-keeping. The decades following Lindisfarne saw increased Norse raiding activity, particularly targeting monasteries, coastal settlements, and vulnerable trading communities. Attacks occurred along the coasts of England, Ireland, and mainland Europe. The frequency and intensity of these raids increased during the early 9th century, peaking roughly between 830 and 850 CE. However, even during this peak raiding period, Viking activity encompassed far more than attacks on religious institutions. Raiding, motivations, and methodology. Understanding Viking raids requires examining practical motivations beyond simplistic characterizations of mindless brutality. Scandinavian societies, as previously discussed, possess strong martial cultures where military prowess conferred status and prestige. Young men seeking to establish reputations and accumulate wealth through raiding found monasteries and coastal settlements attractive targets. These communities possessed concentrated wealth but limited defensive capacity, offering favorable risk-reward calculations for raiding groups. The economic motivation for raiding was substantial. A successful monastery raid could yield precious metals, jewelry, religious artifacts, valuable not for religious significance to Vikings, but for material worth, livestock, and portable goods that could be transported back to Scandinavia or traded in commercial markets. This wealth accumulation exceeded what individual Norse farmers could achieve through agricultural labor or small-scale trading, creating powerful incentive structures motivating raiding activity. Raiding also operated within broader prestige and status systems. Warriors who led successful raids and returned with substantial plunder gained reputation, attracted followers, and enhanced their social position. This created cyclical incentives. Successful raiders attracted more warriors, enabling larger expeditions with greater plunder, further enhancing reputations. Kings and jarls who could attract and reward warriors gained military power, facilitating political consolidation. Raids were not random or indiscriminate attacks on all targets. Norse raiders carefully selected objectives offering wealth concentration without excessive defensive capability. Major fortified settlements, well-armed military concentrations, and defended towns were generally avoided. Instead, raids targeted monasteries, coastal villages, isolated trading centers, and other locations with concentrated movable wealth and minimal defensive forces. This demonstrated tactical calculation rather than mindless aggression. The methodology of raids typically involved surprise assault, followed by rapid collection of movable valuables and equally rapid retreat. Unlike later conquest campaigns, early raids were not intended to establish permanent control over territories. Raiders struck quickly, accumulated portable wealth, and withdrew to ships before substantial defensive forces could organize. This hit-and-run methodology differed fundamentally from the territorial conquest that characterized later Viking expansion. The brutality of raids when violence occurred included killings, enslavement, and destruction. Monasteries presented particular difficulties as monks sometimes chose death over submission, and their resistance provoked violent response. Civilian populations faced similar dangers. However, again, this violence should be contextualized within medieval norms. European warfare regularly included massacre of civilian populations, destruction of settlements, and enslavement of captives. Viking raids were distinctive in targeting monasteries particularly heavily, and in the shock their maritime assault generated, not in the fundamental brutality of warfare itself. The expansion phase, settlement, and integration. Beginning in the early 9th century, Viking activity shifted gradually from purely raiding operations towards settlement and integration in occupied territories. This transition was neither sudden nor complete. Raiding continued throughout the Viking Age, but represented increasing investment in territorial control and permanent habitation. The chronology of this expansion reveals distinct regional patterns. Norwegian Vikings initially focused on Atlantic expansion. The Shetland and Orkney Islands were settled early in the 9th century. The Hebrides followed. Ireland saw significant Norse settlement beginning around 840 CE. Iceland was colonized around 870 CE, and Greenland around 985 CE. These Atlantic settlements followed a rough chronological progression, with earlier settlements providing stepping stone experiences informing later ventures. Irish settlement represents an instructive case study in Viking expansion and integration. Norse raiders attacked Irish monasteries beginning in the 790s CE, concentrating particularly on wealthy ecclesiastical establishments. However, by the 9th century, Norse settlers established permanent settlements in Ireland, particularly in coastal locations. Dublin became a major Norse settlement, developing into one of medieval Ireland's most significant urban centres. Archaeological evidence reveals sophisticated urban infrastructure, including harbour facilities, market areas, and residential and craft quarters. Within generations, Norse settlers in Ireland intermarried with local populations, adopted elements of Irish culture, and became partially integrated within Irish political structures. By the 10th century, Norse-Irish, Ostmen, represented distinct hybrid communities, maintaining some Norse cultural characteristics while functioning within Irish social frameworks. This pattern of raider to settler to integrated population repeated across multiple Viking settlement zones. Danish Vikings pursued different expansion patterns, focusing on England and northern France. The Great Heathen Army, according to English chronicles, invaded England in 865 CE, establishing bases and gradually conquering substantial territories. This represented a different scale of operation than earlier raids, not opportunistic attacks, but sustained military campaigns aimed at territorial acquisition. Over several decades, Danish forces conquered significant portions of eastern and northern England, establishing the Danelaw, regions where Scandinavian settlement transformed the demographic and cultural landscape. The establishment of the Danelaw represented gradual territorial acquisition rather than instant conquest. English kingdoms initially resisted, but Viking military forces, particularly those led by Ragnar Lothbrok's sons, proved formidable. Battles were fought with varying outcomes. Eventually, treaties formalized territorial divisions, with Vikings controlling northeastern territories, while English kingdoms retained southern and western regions. This settlement pattern, like Ireland, involved permanent Norse migration, including families and livestock, not merely military occupation by warriors. Within Danelaw territories, Norse settlement created distinctive characteristics, visible in archaeological and linguistic evidence. Place names reveal Norse settlement patterns, with Scandinavian naming conventions clearly visible in modern English geography. Archaeological finds from settlement sites demonstrate Norse craftspeople, household items, and agricultural practices integrating with existing Anglo-Saxon populations. Over generations, cultural integration occurred, with Norse and English populations blending through intermarriage and cultural exchange. Swedish expansion, the Varangian roots. While Norwegian and Danish Vikings focused on Atlantic and Western European expansion, Swedish Vikings pursued different geographic trajectories. Known as Varangians by Byzantine and Islamic sources, Swedish traders and warriors penetrated Eastern European river systems, establishing trading networks extending to Constantinople and the Islamic world. Swedish expansion eastward followed river networks, particularly the Volga, Dnieper, and Don rivers. These waterways provided penetration deep into continental interiors, reaching wealthy trading centers and facilitating access to valuable goods unavailable in Scandinavia. Unlike Western European expansion, which combined raiding with settlement, Swedish Eastern expansion emphasized commerce and trading post establishment. Swedish merchants established permanent trading settlements at strategic river locations, creating commercial infrastructure that facilitated exchange with interior populations. The establishment of Novgorod and Kiev by Swedish traders illustrates this pattern. These cities, developing as major medieval trading centers, originated as Norse trading posts, establishing themselves in rich river systems. Swedish merchants facilitated trade between Scandinavian populations and interior Russian tribes, creating profitable exchange networks. Over time, these trading centers developed into significant cities, eventually becoming centers of East Slavic political power. Archaeological evidence from Norse settlements in Russia reveals trader warriors adapting to local conditions while maintaining Scandinavian cultural elements. Norse craftspeople produced goods for local markets. Norse warriors served as mercenary forces for emerging Slavic rulers, and Norse merchants integrated themselves into local trading systems. This represents pragmatic adaptation rather than cultural rigidity, with Norse populations modifying their practices based on local requirements while maintaining identity markers visible in grave goods, artistic styles, and settlement patterns. The Varangian Guard, elite warrior units serving Byzantine emperors, demonstrates another form of Norse expansion. Swedish and Norwegian warriors offered their services to Constantinople's rulers, forming military units that became integral to Byzantine defense. These were not conquering invaders, but professional soldiers hired for martial expertise, eventually integrating into Byzantine institutional structures through long service and intermarriage. Slave trade and human commodities. Slavery represented a crucial component of Viking expansion, though this aspect receives inconsistent attention in popular representations. Norse raiders captured prisoners during attacks, and a significant portion of captives became enslaved rather than ransomed. Captive populations included monks, monks' servants, and civilians from raided communities. These captives were either retained in Scandinavian societies as thralls or transported to market centres for sale. Major trading centres developed explicit slave markets. Dublin, the major Norse settlement in Ireland, functioned as a significant slave market where captives from Irish raids could be sold. Arabic sources document slave trade between Scandinavian merchants and Islamic markets, with Norse traders selling European captives to Islamic purchasers. This commerce was lucrative. Enslaved individuals represented valuable commodities with consistent market demand. The scale of this slave trade remains partially uncertain, as detailed statistics are unavailable. However, evidence suggests substantial numbers. Some chroniclers mention thousands of captives taken in individual raids, though these numbers may be exaggerated. Certainly, tens of thousands of individuals were enslaved and traded across generations of raiding and commercial activity. This slavery was distinct from later Atlantic slavery in several crucial ways. It was not race-based, with enslaved populations including Europeans of all ethnic backgrounds. It operated within systems where manumission, while uncommon, was possible, and it existed within European medieval contexts where slavery itself was common, though Norse societies maintained higher proportions of enslaved populations than many contemporary European regions. Decline of raiding and transition to consolidation. Raiding intensity declined significantly after the mid-10th century, though the cessation was gradual rather than sudden. Multiple factors contributed to this transition. European defences improved substantially. Communities learned from repeated attacks, establishing fortified settlements, coastal watches, and organised military responses to Viking incursions. Fortified towns and defended monasteries became standard, raising the costs and risks of raiding operations. Simultaneously, established kingdoms consolidated military power. French kings strengthened defences, English rulers organised effective resistance, and other European powers developed military capacities matching or exceeding those of raiders. The Battle of Edington, 878 CE, where English King Alfred defeated a Viking force, signalled the emerging possibility of decisive resistance. Over the following decades, European military capabilities continued improving, while raiding opportunities diminished. Economic calculations shifted as well. As immediate raiding opportunities decreased and territorial acquisition increased, strategic incentives favoured consolidation over continuous expansion. Rulers controlling established territories pursued political legitimacy through integration with existing European structures. Christian conversion became politically advantageous, facilitating diplomatic relations with Christian kingdoms and legitimizing rule within Christian frameworks. By the mid-10th century, Scandinavian populations that had conquered territories or established settlements were transitioning from external raiders toward regional rulers integrating into European feudal systems. This process was neither linear nor uniform. Some communities maintained raiding as an important activity, but the overall pattern reflected transition from external threat to internal integration, cultural synthesis and legacy of the expansion period. The expansion period established patterns of cultural interaction that would characterize the remainder of the medieval period. Norse settlement created hybrid communities combining Scandinavian and local cultural elements. Place names, language evolution, artistic traditions, and social structures reflected these syntheses. In Normandy, where Vikings were granted territorial rights by Frankish rulers, the synthesis was particularly pronounced. Within generations, Norse settlers adopted Frankish language, Catholic Christianity, and feudal institutional structures. Their descendants, termed Normans, became indistinguishable from other French nobility, eventually conquering England in 1066 CE and establishing the Norman dynasty. These Normans were descended from Viking raiders, yet maintained little explicit connection to Scandinavian identity beyond genealogy. This transformation illustrates crucial aspects of Viking Age expansion. Scandinavian peoples possessed cultural flexibility, adapting to local conditions and integrating into existing structures rather than rigidly imposing Scandinavian systems. The apparent fierceness of initial contact should not obscure the fundamental adaptability that enabled Scandinavian populations to establish themselves within diverse medieval contexts. The expansion period, from 793 to roughly 950 CE, thus represents neither simple conquest nor sustained external threat. Rather, it constitutes a complex process of raiding, settlement, gradual territorial acquisition, and cultural integration reshaping medieval European geography, demographics, and social structures. Understanding this period requires moving beyond romantic narratives of fearless warriors or sensationalized accounts of brutal raiding, instead recognizing the practical motivations, tactical calculations, and long-term integration patterns characterizing Norse expansion. Part 3. Exploration and Settlement. Norse Atlantic voyages and navigation. Norse maritime exploration during the Viking Age extended further than commonly recognized in popular culture, though the extent and nature of these voyages require careful historical examination. Beginning in the 9th century, Norse navigators ventured into the Atlantic Ocean, establishing settlements in progressively distant locations and demonstrating sophisticated maritime capabilities adapted to challenging northern waters. The Atlantic expansion followed a geographical progression that was neither random nor accidental, but reflected careful accumulation of navigational knowledge. Norwegian Vikings initially expanded to nearby island groups, the Shetland Islands and Orkney Islands, which provided stepping stone bases for further expansion. These early settlements, dating to the early 9th century, were relatively close to Scandinavia, requiring voyages of only a few days under favourable conditions. They established patterns of settlement that would repeat in more distant locations. Communities established themselves in defensible locations with access to fishing, hunting, and eventually agricultural resources. The Hebrides, the Scottish island chain off the western coast of Scotland, represented the next stage of Atlantic expansion. Norse settlement occurred gradually during the 9th and 10th centuries, with Vikings establishing control over these islands and incorporating them into Norse political and commercial systems. The Hebrides provided access to Irish sea trade routes and facilitated interaction with Irish and Scottish populations. Archaeological evidence reveals Norse settlement patterns, with Scandinavian place names and artifacts indicating sustained Norse occupation over multiple generations. Navigation across open ocean required sophisticated knowledge and considerable courage. Unlike Mediterranean navigation, which could rely on established routes, visible landmarks, and coastal island hopping, Atlantic navigation necessitated crossing stretches of open water without intervening land. Norse navigators developed techniques enabling remarkable maritime achievements. Direct evidence of specific navigation methods is limited, as Vikings left few written records of their navigational practices. However, combining archaeological evidence, medieval texts, and experimental archaeology provides insights into methods employed. Celestial navigation using solar observation likely represented a primary technique. The sun's position in the sky changes throughout the year and according to latitude, enabling reasonably accurate directional orientation. Norse navigators possessed sophisticated understanding of these patterns, accumulating knowledge through generations of observation. The relationship between solar position and season would enable them to maintain directional consistency across open ocean crossings. Astronomical observation, particularly noting the positions of stars, likely supplemented solar navigation, particularly during northern latitudes, where long daylight hours in summer and darkness in winter created seasonal variation in usable celestial references. The hypothetical sunstones, crystals with light polarizing properties that could enable navigation under cloudy conditions, remain controversial among scholars. Certain crystals, particularly Iceland spar, calcite, possess birefringence properties potentially enabling navigators to determine solar position even when clouds obscure direct visibility. Sagas reference sunstones, and some researchers argue this represents preserved navigational knowledge. However, archaeological evidence for sunstone use remains absent, and whether Vikings possessed or utilized such technology remains disputed. More certainly, experiential knowledge accumulated through generations of sailing created understanding of wind patterns, currents, sea conditions, and seasonal variation enabling navigation without technological aids. Dead reckoning, estimating position based on direction, elapsed time, and speed, likely represented another navigational technique. Experienced sailing specific routes would enable estimation of travel time under various conditions. Combining this with directional knowledge from celestial observation would enable reasonably accurate navigation across known routes. However, this method accumulated error over extended voyages, limiting its reliability for voyages covering hundreds of kilometers across open ocean without reference points. The actual techniques employed likely involved combinations of these methods adapted to specific voyages. Different routes probably required different navigational approaches. Summer voyages, with extended daylight, could rely more heavily on solar observation. Voyages following established routes with accumulated experiential knowledge could reduce reliance on formal navigation techniques. The flexibility and adaptability characterizing Norse maritime practice enabled successful navigation despite the absence of technical instruments. Importantly, Norse navigation capabilities, while impressive, should not be exaggerated into superhuman achievement. Successful voyages required adequate weather, functional ships, and experienced crews. Failed voyages certainly occurred, but are underrepresented in historical records emphasizing successful expeditions. Shipwrecks and lost expeditions were likely common, with only successful voyages producing historical record through settlement establishment or trader reports. This survivorship bias in historical documentation should be recognized when evaluating Norse navigational achievements. Iceland, settlement and society. Development. Iceland, a remote island positioned roughly halfway between Scandinavia and Greenland, was settled by Norse populations around 870 CE. Though earlier temporary occupation by Irish monks may have occurred, the island's settlement represented a significant logistical achievement, requiring transport of families, livestock, tools, and seeds across several hundred kilometers of open Atlantic. Multiple waves of settlement occurred during the late 9th century, with approximately 10,000 to 20,000 individuals migrating to Iceland during initial settlement. The motivation for Icelandic settlement was complex. Norwegian King Harald Fairhair's consolidation of Norwegian territory and assertion of royal authority over previously independent chieftains created political pressures encouraging emigration. Nobles and warrior chieftains opposed to centralized authority sought escape from royal control. Simultaneously, Iceland offered genuine opportunities: land availability for settlement, fishing and hunting resources, and freedom from external political control. These incentives combined to motivate substantial migration despite Iceland's harsh environment. Settlement patterns in Iceland reflected the island's geography. Coastal locations provided access to fishing, maritime trade, and potential contact with other Norse populations. Interior icefields and harsh mountain terrain remained largely unpopulated. Archaeological evidence reveals farmstead distribution following available agricultural land, with settlements concentrated in coastal areas, offering moderate climate and grazing opportunities. Initial settlement occurred in favorable coastal locations. Subsequent population expansion gradually shifted to less optimal terrain as population pressure increased and settlement became more established. Icelandic society developed distinctive characteristics, reflecting both Norse cultural traditions and adaptation to island isolation. A hierarchical system emerged with chieftains, termed godar, plural of godi, literally priest or chief, controlling regional territories and wielding political and religious authority. These chieftains maintained retinues of followers, bound through kinship and obligation networks. Beneath this aristocracy existed free farmers and traders, with thralls comprising a substantial portion of the population. The establishment of the Althing, around 930 CE, represented a significant political development. This assembly, gathering chieftains and their representatives annually, created mechanisms for dispute resolution, lawmaking, and religious observation. The Althing represented an early form of parliamentary governance, though authority remained distributed among regional chieftains, rather than concentrated in centralized rulership. This assembly functioned for approximately 1,000 years, making it one of the world's longest continuous parliaments, though with substantial evolution in institutional structure and authority. Icelandic law underwent formalization during the 10th and 11th centuries, with legal codes establishing rights and obligations for different social classes. These legal developments reflected both Norse traditions and practical necessities of island society. Property rights, inheritance regulations, and dispute settlement mechanisms were established. The legal system included provision for outlawing, banishment, a severe punishment separating individuals from protective legal structures and community support. Iceland developed a distinctive literary tradition during the High Medieval period, producing sagas, lengthy prose narratives describing historical events, genealogies, and dramatic conflicts. While composed centuries after the events they describe, sagas preserve valuable historical information, combined with literary embellishment and mythological elements. Texts like the Landnámabók, Book of Settlements, document settlement patterns and family genealogies. Sagas describing individual chieftains and their exploits provide narrative accounts of Icelandic society, though requiring careful interpretation to distinguish historical events from literary creation. The development of writing and literature in Iceland was unusual for the medieval period. Unlike most medieval societies where literacy concentrated in religious institutions and elite secular populations, Iceland developed broader literacy, reaching merchant classes and some farmers. Runes, the ancient Germanic alphabet, were gradually replaced by Latin alphabet, adapted from Christian sources. By the 12th century, writing became sufficiently common that significant literary production occurred outside purely religious contexts. This distinctive cultural development partially reflected Iceland's geographic isolation, forcing community reliance on internal resources and knowledge transmission. Greenland, settlement and limits of Norse expansion. Greenland's settlement by Eric the Red around 985 CE represented the extension of Norse Atlantic expansion to its extreme northern limits. Eric, expelled from Iceland for murder, sought refuge and opportunity in Greenland, establishing settlements on the island's southwestern coast, where climate permitted agricultural and pastoral activity. The settlement, termed Eystribygd, Eastern Settlement, developed into a functioning Norse community involving hundreds of individuals living in scattered farmsteads across favourable locations. A second settlement, Vestribygd, Western Settlement, developed later in the 10th century, with population distributed across even more challenging terrain. Archaeological evidence reveals farmstead remains, demonstrating settlement patterns adapted to local conditions. Buildings constructed partly underground provided insulation in harsh climate. Livestock, cattle, sheep, and goats were maintained despite environmental challenges. Hunting provided crucial subsistence, with seal and whale hunting supplementing agricultural production. The motivation for Greenland's settlement, like Iceland, involved flight from Norwegian authority, combined with opportunities for land acquisition and relative independence. Eric's name, Eric the Red, derived from his reddish hair, not the colour of the Greenland landscape. His establishment of settlement in Greenland was both practical venture capitalising on island resources and escape from Norwegian and Icelandic legal consequences. His sons, particularly Leif Erikson, would later achieve greater historical fame through further Atlantic exploration. Greenland's settlement represented the practical limits of sustained Norse colonisation in the North Atlantic. The colony never developed into a major population centre, with perhaps 3,000 to 5,000 individuals at peak population. Agriculture was marginal, with farming limited to brief growing seasons and restricted to favourable coastal locations. Hunting and trading became essential subsistence components, with marine mammal hunting providing critical food resources and trade goods. Walrus ivory, produced from Greenlandic hunting, became valuable trade commodity exported to European markets. The integration of Greenland into broader Norse society remained incomplete. Geographic isolation created vulnerability to disrupted trade routes. Periodic Arctic cooling reduced agricultural productivity and marine resource accessibility. By the 15th century, climate deterioration during the Little Ice Age, combined with disrupted trade connections and depletion of valuable hunting resources, rendered sustained settlement economically unviable. The colonies were abandoned gradually, with the Western settlement declining by approximately 1350, and the Eastern settlement persisting until approximately 1500 CE. Vinland and North American exploration. Norse exploration extended beyond Greenland to North America, approximately 1,000 years before Columbus. Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, led expeditions around 1000 CE, reaching lands beyond Greenland, including territories subsequently termed Vinland by Norse sources. Direct evidence for this exploration consists primarily of the Lance aux Meadows archaeological site in Newfoundland, established as Norse settlement around 1000 CE. Archaeological investigation of Lance aux Meadows reveals distinctive Norse structures, tools, and artifacts confirming Norse presence in North America. Building foundations match Norse architectural styles found in Greenland and Iceland. Iron tools, spindle whorls used in textile production, and other domestic items demonstrate Norse settlement rather than temporary visit. Radiocarbon dating consistently places occupation around 1000 CE, coinciding with accounts in Icelandic sagas describing Leif Erikson's voyages. The extent and duration of Norse occupation in North America remains debated. Landsoll Meadows itself appears to have been occupied for only brief periods, perhaps 10 to 20 years, suggesting temporary settlement or trading post rather than permanent colony. Sagas reference exploration of lands south of Newfoundland, including territories termed Markland, Forestland, and Vinland, Wineland, suggesting geographical knowledge extending beyond the confirmed archaeological site. However, archaeological confirmation for settlements beyond Landsoll Meadows remains absent. The Norse encounter with indigenous populations, termed skrælings by Norse sources, likely discouraged sustained settlement. Indigenous populations, particularly in more southerly territories, were more numerous and organized than in northern regions. Sagas describe conflicts with indigenous inhabitants, suggesting resistance, preventing permanent Norse colonization. Unlike Iceland and Greenland, which lacked permanent human populations upon Norse arrival, North America presented established populations capable of defending their territories. This fundamental difference likely explains why Norse expeditions to North America remained temporary, while Atlantic island settlements became established colonies. Norse North American exploration demonstrates significant maritime achievement. Voyages crossing the North Atlantic to distant lands, establishment of temporary settlements in unknown territories, and integration of new geographic knowledge into Norse understanding. However, it also reveals the limits of Norse expansion. Without sustainable economic incentive, valuable trade goods, agricultural productivity, or defensible territory, settlements could not be maintained. The failure to establish lasting North American colonies reflects these practical limitations, rather than technological or navigational deficiency. Trade networks and economic integration. The Atlantic exploration and settlement was not purely an end in itself, but integrated into broader trade networks connecting Scandinavia with distant markets. Iceland and Greenland, while peripherally positioned, functioned within trade systems exchanging Scandinavian and exotic goods. Iceland exported fish products, wool, and other commodities to European markets. Icelandic wool and textiles, produced from extensive sheep herds, became valuable trade goods. Fish, both preserved and fresh, represented significant exports. In return, Iceland imported grain and other agricultural products, supplementing domestic production. Trade connections to Norway, England, and continental Europe provided market access, enabling Icelandic specialization in products suited to island conditions. Greenland's primary trade goods were Arctic products unavailable elsewhere. Walrus ivory commanded high prices in European markets, where demand from ecclesiastical and secular elites created profitable markets. Walrus hide, used for high-quality leather goods, provided another valuable export. Whale products, including baleen and whalebone, supplemented trade. Furs, sealskin, and other Arctic animal furs found markets among wealthy Europeans. These specialized Arctic products gave Greenland economic viability despite harsh environment and limited agricultural productivity. These trade connections were maintained through merchant expeditions traveling between Greenland, Iceland, and European ports. Commercial relationships between Greenland and Norway were particularly significant, with Norwegian merchants provisioning the colony with grain and other supplies while acquiring valuable Arctic products. This trade relationship was not always stable. Disrupted voyages, periods of trade interruption, and commercial disputes created periodic hardship for isolated Greenland communities. Navigation, settlement, and adaptation. Norse exploration and settlement of the Atlantic islands and North American coasts demonstrated consistent patterns, combining navigational sophistication, practical adaptation, and realistic assessment of settlement viability. Successful settlements, Iceland and Greenland, provided economic sustainability through exploitation of local resources and integration into trade networks. Iceland's agricultural potential, despite harsh climate, enabled population development supporting substantial communities. Greenland's Arctic resources filled market niches, providing economic justification for settlement despite environmental challenges. Failed settlement attempts, most clearly represented by the inability to establish lasting North American colonies, reflected genuine obstacles rather than temporary setbacks or cultural failings. Indigenous resistance, limited economic incentive, and distance from established trade networks made sustained settlement impractical, despite technical capability to reach and briefly occupy territories. These practical considerations, not historical inevitability, shaped the geographic boundaries of Norse expansion. The exploration and settlement of the Atlantic islands represents a remarkable chapter in medieval history, demonstrating technological capability, navigational knowledge, and colonizing capacity unsurpassed in Europe during this period. However, understanding this achievement requires recognizing both its genuine accomplishments and its practical limits. The Norse reached distant lands and established remote settlements, but their expansion remained bounded by economic viability and geopolitical resistance, not by technological deficiency or cultural limitations. Part 4. Trade and Commerce. The economic reality of Viking societies. The economic foundation of Viking societies extended far beyond raiding, though popular narrative often emphasizes military activity disproportionately. Extensive archaeological evidence reveals complex trading networks, merchant communities, and commercial infrastructure that comprise the primary economic activity for most Norse populations. While raiding generated dramatic historical record and cultural prestige, trade generated sustainable wealth supporting population growth and social development. Norse merchants established commercial networks spanning from the Atlantic to Baghdad, creating trading systems that connected Scandinavia with distant markets and facilitated exchange of goods across vast distances. These networks were not imposed through military force, but developed through practical commercial relationships, creating mutual benefit for participating communities. Merchants identified profitable goods, established trading partnerships, and developed supply chains enabling sustained commercial relationships. The scale and sophistication of Viking Age commerce should not be underestimated. Norse merchants operated within established medieval trade systems, integrating themselves into existing commercial structures rather than operating as external disruptions. They competed with other merchant communities, Byzantine traders, Islamic merchants, and European Christian merchants, for access to valuable goods and profitable markets. This integration into existing commerce rather than external conquest characterized much of Norse economic activity. Norse merchants themselves represented a distinctive social category within Viking societies. Termed jarls or, in some contexts, landsmen, landholders, successful merchants accumulated wealth rivaling that of traditional military warriors. This created alternative prestige pathways beyond warfare, enabling individuals to achieve status and influence through commercial success. Merchant families established trading dynasties, with sons inheriting commercial networks and knowledge accumulated by predecessors. This institutionalization of commerce enabled long-term commercial relationships transcending individual merchant lifespans. The profitability of merchant activity attracted substantial involvement from Norse populations. Archaeological evidence of merchant settlements, market facilities, and commercial artifacts demonstrates the significance of commerce in Norse economic life. Written sources describe merchant expeditions, commercial transactions, and trading relationships. The Varangian trade routes, Irish sea commerce, and Baltic trading networks all generated wealth flowing into Scandinavian communities, supporting not merely aristocratic elites, but broader populations. The Varangian trade routes and Eastern commerce Swedish merchants, termed Varangians by Byzantine and Islamic sources, established the most extensive long-distance trading networks of the Viking Age. These merchants penetrated Eastern European river systems, particularly the Volga, Dnieper, and Don rivers, creating trading routes connecting Scandinavia with Constantinople, the Islamic world, and Central Asia. These routes represented some of the most profitable commercial ventures of the medieval period, generating wealth that flowed back to Scandinavian sources. The establishment of trading posts along Russian rivers marked the initial stage of Varangian commerce. Merchants established fortified settlements at strategic river locations, creating bases for commercial operations and providing security for valuable merchandise. These settlements, termed emporia, functioned as market centers where local populations could exchange goods with Norse merchants. Over time, some settlements developed into significant urban centers, most notably Novgorod and Kiev, which eventually became major medieval cities dominating Eastern European politics and commerce. Novgorod, established as a Norse trading post in the 9th century, exemplifies the transformation of trading settlements into significant urban centers. Archaeological and documentary evidence indicates initial Norse establishment of a commercial settlement at this strategically positioned river location. The settlement's favorable geography, providing access to river trade networks while controlling crucial portage routes, contributed to its development. Over subsequent centuries, Novgorod evolved into a major trading center, eventually becoming one of medieval Europe's most significant cities. Kiev's development followed similar patterns, though with greater emphasis on political consolidation. Norse merchants and warriors established settlements in this region, eventually establishing themselves as ruling elites among local Slavic populations. The legendary establishment of the Rurik dynasty, with Rurik, a Norse ruler, founding the dynasty that would dominate Eastern European politics for centuries, illustrates Norse integration into Slavic political structures. However, historical accuracy regarding Rurik's precise historical reality remains debated, with some scholars viewing the Rurik dynasty foundation narrative as legendary rather than historical. The goods flowing through Varangian trade routes reveal the scope and significance of this commerce. Northern goods, furs, amber, walrus ivory, and honey travelled southward, exchanging for goods unavailable in Scandinavia. Byzantine silk, Islamic spices, and Central Asian luxury goods travelled northward. Precious metals, particularly silver, flowed from Islamic sources into Scandinavian hands. The archaeological discovery of thousands of Arabic silver coins in Scandinavian hoards demonstrates the scale of wealth flowing through these trade networks. This silver accumulation in Scandinavia reflected the profitability of Varangian trade routes. Norse merchants purchased Islamic silver with northern goods, realizing substantial profit margins. The accumulated wealth, partially represented by these silver hoards, enabled investment in further commercial ventures, craft production, and eventually coinage production, as Scandinavian rulers sought to monetize wealth into usable currency. Trade in the Western Atlantic and Mediterranean. While Swedish Varangians dominated Eastern trade, other Norse populations engaged in Western and Mediterranean commerce. Norwegian and Danish merchants participated in Atlantic trade networks, exchanging Scandinavian goods with English, Irish, and French markets. These Western trading networks, less geographically extensive than Varangian routes, nonetheless generated significant wealth and created lasting commercial relationships. Irish trade represents a significant component of Western Norse commerce. Dublin's development as a major trading centre involved both military establishment and subsequent commercial development. Scandinavian merchants operating from Dublin engaged in commerce with Irish, English, and continental European partners. Archaeological evidence from Dublin reveals market areas, merchant quarters, and craft production zones, indicating sophisticated commercial infrastructure. The Irish Sea became a commercial highway rather than a barrier, with merchant vessels regularly crossing to access markets on both Irish and British coasts. These maritime traders carried merchandise adapted to market demand, exchanging luxury goods, craft products, and raw materials with established merchant communities. The development of merchant fleets enabled this commerce, with specialized merchant vessels distinct from military longships operating these trading routes. Trade in the North Sea connected Scandinavia with English markets and with continental Europe. Early medieval trading centers like Hedeby in Denmark functioned as major market hubs where northern goods exchanged for southern products. Archaeological evidence from these trading centers reveals sophisticated market infrastructure, including booth structures for individual merchants, warehousing facilities, and mint operations. The concentration of merchant activity in these centers created distinctive urban settlements, organized around commercial activity rather than military or political functions. Mediterranean trade involved Norse merchants engaging with Islamic, Byzantine, and Italian merchant communities. While less extensively documented than Atlantic or Varangian trade, evidence indicates significant Norse participation in Mediterranean commerce. Scandinavian merchant expeditions reached Mediterranean ports, acquiring luxury goods and valuable materials, returning to northern markets. Byzantine sources reference Norse merchants in Constantinople. Islamic sources document Scandinavian traders in Islamic ports. Merchant communities and urban development. The growth of merchant communities created distinctive urban settlements organized around commercial rather than military or political functions. These early medieval trading centers, termed emporia or trade towns, represented novel urban forms featuring market infrastructure, merchant housing, and craft production facilities. Unlike earlier Roman cities, which retained civic and religious functions alongside commerce, these Viking Age trading settlements were explicitly organized for commercial purposes. Hedeby, located in southern Denmark, exemplified the development of Viking Age trading centers. Founded in the early 9th century, Hedeby grew into one of Northern Europe's major trading centers, featuring elaborate defensive fortifications, market structures, and residential areas organized around commercial activity. Archaeological evidence reveals evidence of diverse craft production, including metalworking, textile production, and bone working, suggesting specialized craftspeople serving merchant populations. The mint at Hedeby produced coinage for regional rulers, indicating Hedeby's economic significance. Birka, located in Sweden near modern Stockholm, developed as another major Viking Age trading center. Similar to Hedeby in organization and function, Birka served as focal point for Swedish maritime commerce and trade with Eastern European partners. Archaeologically, Birka reveals evidence of international commerce, including goods imported from distant sources, indicating broad trading networks. The settlement's position controlling access to Swedish interior waterways contributed to its commercial importance. Jorvik, York, in England, transformed from Roman settlement into Viking Age trading centre, following Norse conquest and settlement. Archaeological investigation reveals extensive craft production, market activity, and commercial organization during the Viking period. The Norse transformation of York involved establishing new commercial infrastructure and integrating the city into Norse trading networks. Gradually, Jorvik became a major medieval trading centre, maintaining commercial significance even as political control shifted away from Norse rulers. Dublin developed similarly from small settlement into major trading centre under Norse control. Archaeological evidence reveals gradual development of commercial infrastructure, market facilities, and craft production zones. Norse merchants operating from Dublin engaged in extensive trade with Irish, English, and continental partners. The city's position controlling Irish sea access contributed to its commercial importance, with merchant fleets utilising Dublin's harbour for trade operations. These urban trading centres supported specialised populations engaged in commerce and craft production. Craftspeople produced goods for trade, including textiles, metalwork, and carved objects adapted to market demand. Merchant families established themselves in these centres, creating stable bases for commercial operations. The concentration of commercial activity in these settlements created market effects enabling efficient exchange and specialised production responding to market demand. Specialised goods and comparative advantage. Norse merchants succeeded commercially because they identified profitable goods where Scandinavia possessed relative advantage or unique access. Northern furs, particularly valued in warmer climates where fur-bearing animals were uncommon, became premium trade commodities. Scandinavian merchants controlled access to Russian and Northern Asian furs through established trading networks, enabling profitable trade in these valuable goods. Amber, extracted from Baltic sources accessible to Scandinavian merchants, represented another valuable trade commodity. This fossilized resin possessed aesthetic appeal and was valued for decoration and ornamental purposes across medieval societies. Scandinavian merchants obtained amber and traded it throughout European and Islamic markets at substantial markups. The archaeological discovery of amber in distant locations testifies to this trade's extent. Walrus ivory, obtained from Greenlandic and Arctic hunting operations, provided valuable trade goods with limited alternative sources. Ecclesiastical and secular elites across medieval Europe valued walrus ivory for ecclesiastical vessels, decorative objects, and craft materials. The monopoly position of Scandinavian merchants in walrus ivory trade enabled profitable commerce at premium prices. Honey and beeswax, produced in Scandinavian forests, found markets throughout medieval Europe. Honey provided sweetening in medieval diets. Beeswax provided essential material for candle production. The high demand for these products enabled profitable trade, with Scandinavian merchants exploiting forest resources to supply European markets. In return, Norse merchants acquired goods unavailable in Scandinavia. Grain, particularly essential during poor harvests, was imported from more agriculturally productive regions. Wine, valued as commodity and symbol of status, flowed northward through trade networks. Silk and spices, representing premium luxury goods, accessed Scandinavian markets through long-distance commerce. These imported goods served both consumption and status signaling purposes, with elite populations displaying access to exotic goods, demonstrating wealth and international connections. The Varangian Guard and military commercial integration. The Varangian Guard, elite warrior units serving Byzantine emperors, illustrates the integration of Norse military and commercial activity. Norse and Swedish warriors offered their services to Constantinople's rulers, establishing themselves as professional soldiers serving imperial interests. These warriors, initially arriving through trade connections, established themselves as specialized military force and eventually integrated into Byzantine institutional structures. The Varangian Guard represented a distinctive social phenomenon. Professional soldiers with foreign origins integrated into imperial service. These Norse warriors received regular payments, maintained organizational structure under imperial command, and eventually became hereditary office through family succession. While initially consisting of Norse and Scandinavian recruits, the Guard expanded to include other northerners, eventually incorporating Anglo-Saxon warriors following the Norman conquest of England. Service in the Varangian Guard provided paths to wealth and status for Norse and Scandinavian warriors. Payments and imperial grants provided income exceeding what could be realized through raiding or merchant activity. Imperial service conferred prestige and access to Byzantine society. Some guardsmen established themselves in Constantinople, accumulating wealth and establishing families integrating into Byzantine society. Others, completing service terms, returned to northern homelands with accumulated wealth and imperial connections. This military commercial integration illustrates broader patterns of Norse integration into established medieval societies. Rather than imposing external rule, Norse individuals sought incorporation into existing power structures, achieving status and wealth through service within established systems. The success of the Varangian Guard suggests receptiveness of Norse populations to institutional integration rather than rigid cultural maintenance. Coinage and monetary development. The adoption of coinage by Scandinavian societies during the Viking Age represented significant economic development, reflecting integration into broader European monetary systems. Initially, Scandinavian populations used precious metals by weight for transactions, with merchants carrying portable scales, enabling measurement of appropriate quantities. This system, while functional, lacked standardization and involved transaction inefficiency. Gradually, as contact with coin-using societies increased, Scandinavian rulers began establishing mints, producing coinage bearing royal insignias. Danish mints began coinage production in the 10th century. Norwegian and Swedish mints followed slightly later. Initial coinage imitated established European models, with designs and denominations reflecting designs of more established coin-producing centres. The production of coinage served multiple functions beyond monetary utility. Coinage bearing royal insignia represented assertion of royal authority, legitimizing rulership through monetary control. The ability to mint coinage conferred prestige among medieval rulers, indicating participation in established European political frameworks. Economically, coinage facilitated transaction efficiency compared to precious metal by weight systems, enabling more complex commercial operations. Scandinavian coinage development was gradual and uneven. Not all regions adopted coinage simultaneously. Some continued relying on precious metal weights, even as others minted coins. Integration of coinage into monetary systems was slow, with coins and precious metal weights coexisting in some regions for extended periods. This gradual monetization reflected broader patterns of economic integration rather than sudden transformation. Decline and transformation of trade networks. The Varangian trade routes gradually declined during the 11th and 12th centuries, though this decline was gradual rather than sudden. Multiple factors contributed to this transformation. Overland trade routes through Central Asia developed, offering alternative pathways for east-west commerce, less dependent on Russian river systems. Political fragmentation in Eastern Europe disrupted trade networks requiring stable political conditions for merchant safety. The Crusades, beginning in the 11th century, created alternative trade pathways through Mediterranean ports. Italian merchants, particularly Venetian and Genoese traders, established themselves in Mediterranean and Black Sea trade, eventually dominating long-distance commerce. The development of alternative routes reduced reliance on Varangian pathways, though trade never completely ceased. Simultaneously, Scandinavian political consolidation and integration into established European feudal structures modified commercial activity. As Scandinavian rulers established themselves within Christian European frameworks, their commercial interests shifted. Rather than maximizing merchant profit through long-distance trade, rulers sought to consolidate territorial control and integrate into established European political hierarchies. This reorientation gradually reduced emphasis on merchant commerce as primary economic driver. The transformation of Scandinavian societies from merchant-dominated commercial systems toward feudal political structures represented broader medieval integration process. Scandinavian merchants, rather than disappearing, integrated into established European merchant communities. Scandinavian rulers became feudal nobles participating in Christian European political systems. Commercial activity continued, but within different organizational frameworks reflecting integration into established medieval institutions. Conclusion: commerce as primary Viking activity. Understanding Viking Age economies requires recognizing trade and commerce as primary economic activities rather than secondary to raiding. Archaeological evidence overwhelmingly demonstrates extensive commercial infrastructure, merchant communities, and trading networks characterizing Viking Age societies. While raiding generated dramatic historical record and cultural prestige, commercial activity generated sustainable wealth supporting population growth, urbanization, and social development. Norse merchants successfully competed in medieval commercial systems through exploitation of geographic advantages and development of trading networks, providing mutual benefits for participating communities. The extent and sophistication of Varangian trade networks, Atlantic merchant communities, and trading center development demonstrate commercial capabilities matching or exceeding military achievements. Understanding Vikings requires recognizing them not merely as warriors, but as sophisticated merchants, traders, and commercial operators participating in and shaping medieval economic systems. Part 5. Social structure and daily life. Family organization and kinship systems. Viking societies were fundamentally organized around family and kinship structures, with individual identity derived primarily from familial connections rather than abstract citizenship or national identity. The family unit represented the basic social, economic, and legal structure within which most individuals conducted their lives. Extended family networks, including multiple generations, collateral relatives, and in-laws, created kinship groups that provided mutual support, resource sharing, and collective security. Kinship ties created networks of obligation and reciprocal responsibility, transcending nuclear family boundaries. Individuals could call upon relatives for support in disputes, resource needs, or military ventures. These kinship obligations sometimes conflicted with emerging political hierarchies, creating tensions as centralizing rulers sought loyalty, competing with traditional kinship allegiances. Archaeological evidence from settlement patterns reveals clustering of farmsteads that likely represented kinship groups settled in proximity, enabling cooperative agricultural labor and mutual defense. Marriage represented crucial mechanism for establishing kinship connections between previously unrelated families, creating alliances with political and economic implications. Elite families negotiated marriages strategically, establishing connections with powerful partners and consolidating territorial control. Bride price arrangements, payments from grooms to brides' families, represented property transactions formalized through marriage contracts. Divorce, while permissible, required dissolution of these property arrangements and involved substantial economic negotiation. Women within kinship structures held distinctive positions reflecting their roles in household management and family continuity. As noted previously, women possessed significant legal rights, including property ownership and control over marital property. Widows, particularly those with substantial property holdings, wielded considerable influence over family resources and could exercise decision-making authority comparable to male family heads. Archaeological evidence from elite burials suggests some women wielded military authority, though the extent remains debated among scholars. Household organization and labor division. Norse households organized around mixed agricultural and pastoral economies, requiring coordinated labor from household members. Farmsteads represented not merely residential locations, but economic units integrating multiple productive activities. Archaeological excavations reveal household structures including main residence buildings, animal byres for livestock protection, storage facilities for grain and foodstuffs, and workshops for craft production. The main household building, termed longhouse, served multiple functions including residential space, food preparation, storage, and sometimes craft production. These structures, typically 20 to 30 meters long and 5 to 7 meters wide, featured central hearths providing heat and cooking facilities. Archaeological remains reveal internal divisions, with separate areas for human habitation and livestock, animal shelters integrated into the same structure. This arrangement provided practical advantages. Heat from animals warmed residential space. Proximity facilitated animal care. Integration enabled efficient protection against predators and theft. Labor division within households reflected gender and age distinctions. Men engaged in primary farming tasks, ploughing, field preparation, and harvest, alongside animal herding and hunting. Women managed household production including food preparation, textile production, dairy production, and management of domestic animals. Children contributed labor appropriate to age and capability. Thralls, enslaved people, provided additional labor supplementing household members' efforts. Textile production represented significant household economic activity and female responsibility. Archaeological evidence reveals spindle whorls, loom weights, and dyeing equipment, indicating sophisticated textile production. Women produced cloth for household use and trade, with surplus production providing significant portion of household marketable goods. The quality of surviving textile fragments suggests skilled craftsmanship and knowledge of sophisticated production techniques. Food production and preservation activities dominated seasonal household labor patterns. Spring planting required extensive labor. Summer maintenance involved weeding and monitoring crop growth. Autumn harvest represented intense labor period, requiring full household mobilization. Winter food preservation, smoking meat, salting fish, fermenting vegetables, and creating dairy products occupied much household effort. The success or failure of preservation efforts directly influenced household survival prospects during lean winter months. Diet, nutrition, and health. Archaeological evidence from bone analysis, organic remains, and medieval sources provides insights into Viking Age diet and nutrition. Contrary to popular images emphasizing meat consumption, grain products formed the dietary staple for most Norse populations. Barley and rye, suitable to northern climates, provided primary carbohydrate sources. These grains were prepared as porridge, bread, and fermented beverages. Archaeological evidence from organic deposits reveals consumption of grain products, often mixed with other ingredients, as dietary foundation. Meat represented supplementary rather than primary dietary component for common populations, though elite individuals consumed greater meat quantities. Livestock, cattle, sheep, pigs, and poultry provided meat, but preservation costs and animal value limited consumption frequency. Hunting supplemented domestic meat production, with evidence indicating intensive exploitation of wild game, including deer, boar, and birds. Fishing provided significant protein source in coastal and riverine locations, with archaeological remains indicating sophisticated fishing techniques and substantial fish consumption. Dairy products, milk, cheese, and butter provided important nutritional components and demonstrated preservation capability. Archaeological evidence suggests cheese production and storage, enabling caloric preservation for winter consumption. Vegetables grown in small household gardens supplemented grain and meat diets. Evidence indicates cultivation of cabbage, roots, and legumes, though limited quantity given small garden sizes. Wild plant and fungal gathering supplemented household diet, with women typically responsible for gathering activities. Berries, nuts, and wild plants provided seasonal dietary variation and essential nutritional components. Honey, obtained from beekeeping or wild honey gathering, provided sweetening and medicine. Nutritional analysis of skeletal remains suggests reasonably good health compared to contemporary European populations. Bone pathology indicates minimal evidence of severe malnutrition, though seasonal variation likely occurred with winter months representing relative nutritional stress. Growth patterns visible in skeletal remains suggest adequate nutrition during childhood development, indicating survival through developmental years in most cases. Disease and parasitic infection affected Norse populations, with skeletal evidence indicating tooth loss, bone inflammation, and other pathological conditions. Injuries visible on skeletal remains, healed fractures and trauma scars, indicate common accidents and interpersonal violence. Life expectancy at birth appears comparable to medieval European populations, with many individuals surviving to adulthood and some reaching substantial age, though childhood mortality remained substantial. Craft production and specialized labor. Archaeological evidence reveals diverse craft production within Norse settlements, indicating development of specialized craftspeople producing goods beyond household subsistence requirements. Metalworking remains abundant in archaeological sites, with smithies producing tools, weapons, household items, and decorative goods. The quality of surviving metalwork demonstrates sophisticated technical knowledge and artistic sophistication. Boneworking represented another significant craft activity, with evidence of bone carving workshops producing combs, decorative items, and specialized tools. The artistry visible in surviving bone artifacts indicates skilled craftspeople responding to market demand for decorative goods and specialized items. Archaeological evidence suggests bone-working specialized settlements or household concentrations. Textile production, while household-based, developed specialized aspects with evidence of large-scale production exceeding household consumption. Weaving equipment evidence suggests specialized weavers producing textiles for trade. The complexity and quality of surviving textiles indicates skilled practitioners with advanced knowledge of dyeing, weaving techniques, and fabric production. Woodworking represents another significant craft activity, though evidence is limited due to wood's poor preservation. Surviving wooden artifacts from waterlogged sites demonstrate sophisticated carpentry, shipbuilding, and artistic wood carving. The quality of surviving artifacts indicates skilled practitioners with advanced knowledge of wood properties and working techniques. Pottery production varied regionally, with some areas maintaining hand-thrown pottery production, while others adopted wheel-thrown techniques. Archaeological evidence reveals domestic pottery production, alongside some evidence of specialized pottery workshops. The technological and stylistic variation visible in pottery suggests both household production and specialist craftspeople. Warfare and military organization. Warfare represented significant aspect of Norse societies, with weapons abundant in graves and settlements. However, Understanding Norse warfare requires distinguishing between professional military classes and broader population participation. Elite warriors, jarls, and their retainers received specialized training and maintained constant military readiness. These professional soldiers possessed superior equipment, horses, and training compared to general populations. Common populations participated in warfare less regularly, though all free males potentially could be mobilized for defense or raiding expeditions. Seasonal warfare patterns reflected agricultural requirements, with spring and summer enabling expeditions, while autumn and winter focused on agricultural work and settlement maintenance. This seasonal pattern reduced opportunities for sustained military campaigns and influenced strategic planning. Weapons and equipment reflected military role and wealth status. Elite warriors possessed high-quality swords, axes, and spears crafted from superior iron. Shields, helmets, and armor protected wealthy warriors, while common fighters possessed simpler equipment. Archaeological evidence reveals distinctive weapon styles adapted to specific combat purposes, indicating sophisticated understanding of warfare tactics and equipment requirements. Fortifications protecting settlements indicate organizational capacity for coordinated defense. Archaeological evidence reveals defensive structures ranging from simple wooden palisades to more complex fortified settlements. These defenses suggest both external threats requiring protection and significant investment in settlement security. The development of fortifications indicates evolving military sophistication responding to contemporary threats. Naval warfare represented a distinctive aspect of Norse military activity, with specialized tactics and equipment adapted to maritime combat. Ship-to-ship combat, amphibious assaults, and naval control represented military challenges distinct from land-based warfare. The development of specialized naval forces and tactics indicates adaptation to maritime environment. Religion and ritual practice. Pre-Christian Norse religious practice, as discussed previously, involved polytheistic belief systems, venerating multiple deities. However, daily religious practice and household rituals remain partially obscure due to limited written documentation from pre-Christian Scandinavia. Archaeological evidence provides insights into ritual activities and religious sites, though interpretation remains contested among scholars. Household religious practice likely involved rituals marking agricultural cycles, celebrating seasonal transitions, and honoring deities believed to influence household fortune. Evidence from later Scandinavian sources suggests household rituals involving food offerings and verbal appeals to deities, though historical reliability of these later sources remains debatable. Sacred sites identified through archaeological evidence and place names indicate formal religious centers where community-level religious ceremonies occurred. Some of these sites continued functioning as sacred locations after Christianization, with churches eventually constructed on pagan sacred sites. This continuity suggests religious sites' durability across religious transitions. Christiana conversion occurred gradually in most Scandinavian regions during the 10th and 11th centuries, with varying chronologies across regions. Norwegian conversion occurred under royal promotion, with kings like Olav Tryggvason and Olav II promoting Christianity through combination of incentive and coercion. Danish and Swedish conversions followed similar patterns, with royal rulers promoting Christianity as means of political legitimacy and connection with Christian European kingdoms. Popular conversion followed royal conversion gradually, with many communities maintaining pre-Christian practices alongside Christian observance for extended periods. This syncretism, mixing of Christian and pre-Christian practices, is well documented archaeologically, with evidence of continued pagan ritual practices in Christian contexts. The eventual predominance of Christianity was a gradual process involving institutional consolidation, priestly establishment, and generational transitions rather than sudden religious transformation. Gender relations and women's status. Women in Norse societies occupied distinctive positions reflecting complex legal status, combining restrictions with significant rights. As discussed previously, women could own property independently, inherit wealth, manage estates, and initiate divorce. These rights exceeded those available to women in many contemporary European societies, indicating relatively advanced legal status for medieval society. However, women remained subordinated within patriarchal power structures. Legal authority ultimately rested with male household heads. While women could own property, it remained subject to certain restrictions and male guardianship in some contexts. Political participation remained male-dominated, with women excluded from most formal power structures. The ability to rule territories or kingdoms represented exceptional situation rather than normal female activity. Archaeological evidence suggests women's participation in military activity in some contexts, though the extent remains debated. Some burial evidence reveals women with weapons, suggesting participation in warfare. However, whether this indicates regular female warriors, exceptional circumstances, or alternative status categories remains unclear. Saga accounts reference shield maidens, but reliable historical documentation for organized female military units remains limited. Women's artisanal production, particularly textile manufacturing, provided significant household and commercial value. Elite women, particularly widows managing substantial estates, wielded economic power comparable to male property holders. Some aristocratic women exercised substantial political influence, particularly through marriage alliances and wealth management. Marriage practices involved considerable economic negotiation and property transfer. Bride price arrangements transferred property from grooms to brides' families, creating economic interdependence between families. Divorce, permitted under certain circumstances, involved dissolution of these property arrangements and could result in substantial compensation. The ability to initiate divorce represented significant female right, though divorce rates remain uncertain. Sexual violence against women appears documented in saga accounts and legal codes, with provisions for compensation reflecting institutional recognition of women's sexual vulnerability. Concubinage represented permissible relationship form, with concubines receiving legal recognition and potential pathways to marriage. These practices reflect male-dominated sexual systems where women's autonomy was restricted within patriarchal frameworks. Settlement patterns and urban development. Archaeological evidence reveals distinctive settlement patterns reflecting both settlement period and geographic circumstances. In favorable agricultural regions, dispersed farmstead settlement predominated, with individual households establishing themselves in locations offering adequate agricultural land and resource access. These scattered settlements created settlement hierarchies, with some farmsteads substantially larger and wealthier than others, indicating social differentiation within rural communities. Trading settlements and craft production centers, as discussed previously, represented distinctive settlement types. These urban-like settlements concentrated merchant and craft populations, creating market infrastructure and commercial facilities. Population concentration in these settlements reflected economic specialization and market orientation. Fortified settlements, including some traditional defensive centers and new fortifications constructed during Viking Age, protected concentrated populations. These settlements served defensive functions while also functioning as administrative and commercial centers. Archaeological evidence reveals evidence of internal organization with defensive elements, residential areas, and sometimes market facilities. Religious sites, particularly monasteries in Christian regions, represented another settlement category, creating population concentration. Monastic settlements, established at favorable locations, developed infrastructure supporting religious communities and expanding populations. Archaeological evidence from monastery sites reveals evidence of monastic economies based on agricultural production, craft activities, and commercial exchange. Slavery and social subordination. Slavery represented fundamental institution in Norse societies, with thralls constituting substantial population portions and forming economic foundation for many elite households. As previously discussed, slavery provided labor for agricultural production, craft activities, and domestic service. The conditions of enslaved individuals varied substantially, with some living relatively secure within stable households, while others faced harsh treatment and shortened lifespans. Archaeological evidence suggests variation in thrall conditions. Elite households with multiple slaves created hierarchies within enslaved populations, with some slaves managing other slaves and receiving enhanced status. Conversely, households with single slaves relied on enslaved individuals for critical labor, potentially creating closer relationships. The quality of thrall diet, housing, and treatment likely varied substantially based on household circumstances and individual masters' practices. Slavery's profitability encouraged continued enslavement and slave acquisition through raiding and purchase. This economic incentive perpetuated slavery through medieval period, with Norse societies maintaining notably high proportions of enslaved populations compared to many contemporary European regions. The integration of slavery into economic systems discouraged voluntary abolition, despite some religious incentives toward manumission. Manumission, the freeing of enslaved individuals, occurred in various contexts, though frequency remains uncertain. Some masters freed slaves as religious act, particularly after Christian conversion. Others manumitted slaves in exchange for substantial payment. Freed slaves gained legal freedom, but often remained dependent on former masters and faced social subordination. Descendants of freed slaves gradually integrated into free populations over generations, though stigma from enslaved origins potentially persisted. Conclusion: complex societies beyond warrior stereotypes. Understanding. Viking Age. Daily life requires recognizing complex societies, extending far beyond warrior stereotypes. Farming communities, merchant settlements, craft producers, and religious institutions characterized Norse societies. Family organization, labor division, and economic cooperation enabled household survival in challenging northern environments. Gender relations, while patriarchal, granted women distinctive rights and economic authority. Warfare and military organization, while significant, represented one aspect of complex societies emphasizing commerce, craft production, and religious practice. This complexity challenges simplified characterizations presenting Vikings as purely warrior societies, demonstrating instead sophisticated communities managing agricultural production, commercial networks, craft specialization, and institutional organization comparable to contemporary European societies. Part 6. Legacy and Decline. The end of the Viking Age, 1066 and beyond. The year 1066 CE conventionally marks the end of the Viking Age, a periodization based on significant historical events, signaling transformation rather than abrupt termination. Two major events occurred this year, with profound implications for Scandinavian and Northern European history. The Battle of Stamford Bridge, fought in Yorkshire in September 1066, witnessed the defeat and death of Norwegian King Harald, who attempted to conquer England. Weeks later, the Norman conquest of England following the Battle of Hastings established William the Conqueror on the English throne, fundamentally altering English political structures. These events represent symbolic endpoints rather than sudden transformations. By 1066, Scandinavian societies had already substantially transformed from external raiders into established regional kingdoms integrated within Christian European frameworks. The Viking Age's end represented culmination of gradual processes rather than catastrophic reversal. However, these events signal recognition by contemporary observers that Scandinavian expansion and external threat had fundamentally diminished. The Battle of Stamford Bridge exemplifies this transition. Harald Hardrada, though styled as traditional Viking warrior king, actually represented institutionalized Scandinavian monarchy, seeking political advantage through English conquest. His military force, while substantial, faced organized English resistance under King Harold Godwinson. The battle's outcome, a decisive English victory despite initial Norse success, demonstrated that European military capabilities had evolved to match or exceed Scandinavian forces. This contrasted sharply with earlier centuries when Norse raiders faced limited effective resistance. The Norman conquest of England, while led by descendant of Viking settlers, represented something fundamentally different from Viking Age expansion. William the Conqueror and his Norman nobility, though descended from Vikings who settled Normandy generations earlier, had adopted Frankish feudal structures, French language, and Christian institutional frameworks. The Norman conquest represented integration of previously Viking-descended populations into European feudal systems rather than continuation of Viking expansion. Political consolidation and Christianization. By the 11th century, Scandinavian societies had completed transitions from decentralized chiefdom structures towards centralized monarchies, claiming legitimate authority over defined territories. Kings in Norway, Denmark, and Sweden established themselves as supreme rulers, gradually subordinating regional jarls and chieftains to royal authority. This political consolidation involved warfare, negotiation, and institutional development, creating hierarchical structures distinct from earlier dispersed power distributions. Christianization accompanied and facilitated political centralization. Christian ideology, particularly concepts of divinely ordained kingship, provided ideological justification for monarchical authority. Conversion to Christianity enabled Scandinavian rulers to claim legitimacy within Christian European frameworks, facilitating diplomatic relations and establishing connections with Christian kingdoms. Church institutions, bishops, monasteries, and ecclesiastical organizations provided infrastructure supporting royal administration and legitimacy. The conversion process varied chronologically and methodologically across Scandinavian regions. Norwegian conversion occurred through combination of royal promotion and popular adoption, with kings like Olav II promoting Christianity through forceful means alongside genuine religious conviction. Danish and Swedish conversions followed similar patterns, with royal rulers leveraging Christian conversion for political advantage, while gradual popular conversion occurred through generational transition and institutional establishment. Christianization did not eliminate Scandinavian cultural identity, but transformed its expression. Norse culture persisted within Christian frameworks, with Scandinavian languages, artistic traditions, and literary practices continuing. However, the integration of Christian institutions, clerical education, and religious ideology fundamentally altered cultural practices and intellectual frameworks. Pre-Christian religious traditions gradually faded as Christian monasticism and clerical establishment monopolized literacy and intellectual production. Economic transformation and the rise of feudalism. The transition from Viking Age economies, emphasizing long-distance merchant trade and raiding toward feudal territorial economies, reflected broader medieval economic transformations. Scandinavian rulers increasingly focused on territorial consolidation and feudal hierarchy establishment rather than merchant profit maximization. While trade continued, it operated within feudal frameworks emphasizing territorial control and hierarchical obligation rather than merchant autonomy. The Varangian trade routes declined as alternative commercial pathways developed, and Eastern European political fragmentations disrupted stable trading conditions. Italian merchant republics, Venice and Genoa, increasingly dominated Mediterranean and Black Sea trade, establishing trading posts and commercial networks competing with and eventually superseding established Varangian pathways. The development of overland Silk Road connections and shifting geopolitical conditions reduced reliance on Russian riverine routes. Scandinavian merchants gradually integrated into European merchant communities rather than maintaining separate Norse trading networks. Norwegian merchants engaged in North Sea and Atlantic trade within European commercial systems. Danish merchants participated in Baltic and North Sea commerce as integrated participants rather than dominant force. Swedish merchants, particularly from coastal cities like Stockholm, continued commercial activity within transformed frameworks. Urban development in Scandinavia shifted toward consolidation within feudal political structures. Trading centres like Hedeby declined in importance as fortified royal administrative centres became focal points for political authority. New urban settlements developed around royal fortifications and ecclesiastical centres, reflecting political and religious reorganisation rather than merchant autonomy. The shift represented integration into feudal systems, emphasizing territorial control over merchant profit. Agricultural reorganization accompanied political consolidation. The gradual introduction of feudal tenure systems transformed land relationships, with peasants increasingly bound to specific lords and obligated to provide labor and payment obligations. This represented movement away from earlier property arrangements and increasingly resembled Western European feudal systems. The transformation occurred gradually, with older property arrangements persisting in some regions longer than others. Cultural integration and linguistic legacy. The linguistic legacy of Viking Age expansion profoundly influenced medieval European languages. English vocabulary retained substantial Norse etymological components from centuries of Danish and Norwegian settlement and cultural contact. Common English words including sky, they, husband, law, and hundreds of other terms derived from Old Norse etymology. Place names throughout England, particularly in northern and eastern regions, reveal Scandinavian naming conventions and settlement patterns. Normandy, settled by Vikings generations earlier, retained cultural markers of Scandinavian heritage despite French language adoption and political integration. Norman legal practices, military organization, and cultural traditions reflected Scandinavian influences even after generations of French cultural integration. The Norman conquest of England, while not truly Viking conquest, represented triumph of previously Viking-descended populations within European feudal frameworks. Ireland maintained distinctive Norse-Irish Ostmen cultural traditions in cities like Dublin, though gradual integration into Irish political structures occurred. Scandinavian place names, particularly in Irish coastal cities, marked Viking settlement. Genetic evidence indicates substantial Norse settlement population in Irish coastal regions, with genetic markers indicating Scandinavian ancestry persisting in Irish populations. Russian development incorporated Scandinavian elements within Slavic cultural frameworks. The Rurik dynasty, whether truly founded by Norse settlers or legendary creation, claimed Scandinavian origins. Early Kievan Rus contained Scandinavian cultural elements, though dominant culture was Slavic and Christian Orthodox. Archaeological evidence reveals gradual cultural synthesis, with Scandinavian material culture elements disappearing as populations adopted Slavic practices and Christianization proceeded. Iceland maintained the most distinctive Norse cultural preservation, with language preserving Old Norse characteristics and literary traditions maintaining connection with Viking Age heritage. Icelandic sagas, composed in subsequent centuries, preserved narratives describing Viking Age activities, though requiring careful interpretation to distinguish historical events from literary creation. Iceland's geographic isolation enabled cultural continuity impossible in more integrated regions. Romanticization and misrepresentation in historiography. The historical image of Vikings has undergone substantial transformation since the Viking Age itself, with modern interpretations reflecting contemporary ideologies and preoccupations rather than accurate historical understanding. 19th century nationalist movements, particularly in Scandinavia and Germany, appropriated Viking imagery for political purposes. The concept of the Viking as noble warrior culture reflected 19th century romanticism rather than historical reality. Nazi ideology particularly distorted Viking history, appropriating Norse symbolism and mythology for racist purposes. The representation of Vikings as embodying Aryan racial superiority, though fundamentally inconsistent with historical evidence, influenced popular understanding. Post-World War II historiography has worked to correct these distortions, emphasizing evidence-based analysis and avoiding nationalist or racial interpretation. Modern entertainment perpetuates exaggerations and romanticization. Television series, films, and popular literature depict Vikings as superhuman warriors, mystical figures with magical powers, or noble savages living in harmony with nature. These depictions bear limited relationship to historical reality. While engaging entertainment, they transmit inaccurate historical understanding to popular audiences. The emphasis on warfare and raiding in entertainment media reflects dramatic requirements rather than historical accuracy regarding the breadth of Viking Age activities. Academic historiography has progressively developed more nuanced understandings, based on archaeological evidence, textual analysis, and interdisciplinary approaches. Feminist scholarship has challenged male-dominated narratives emphasizing warfare, highlighting women's roles and status. Archaeological investigation has revealed the importance of commerce, craft production, and settlement development. Genetic and skeletal analysis has provided evidence regarding diet, health, and population origins. This scholarly development represents progression toward more accurate historical understanding. Archaeological evidence and historical reconstruction. The fundamental sources for understanding Viking Age societies have shifted progressively toward archaeological evidence rather than exclusive reliance on textual sources. Medieval chroniclers, predominantly Christian monks, recorded Viking activities from perspectives influenced by religious ideology and victimization through raiding. These sources, while valuable, contain substantial bias and selective emphasis on warfare and raiding while underrepresenting commerce, settlement, and daily life. Archaeological excavation has revealed extensive settlement remains, household items, tools, weapons, and artistic products, providing direct evidence of daily life and material culture. Waterlogged sites in northern Europe have preserved organic materials, wood, textiles, and food remains, rarely surviving in normal conditions. These discoveries have fundamentally transformed understanding of Viking Age societies, revealing complexity and sophistication in domestic life, craft production, and settlement organization. Genetic analysis has enabled new understanding of population movements, settlement patterns, and genetic admixture between Scandinavian and local populations. DNA studies confirm substantial Norse settlement in colonized territories and reveal genetic ancestry persistence in modern populations. This evidence has corroborated historical accounts while providing new insights into migration patterns and demographic impact. Skeletal analysis has provided evidence regarding nutrition, disease patterns, injury prevalence, and general health status. This evidence has corrected misconceptions regarding Viking Age health and hardship, revealing nutritional adequacy and health patterns comparable to contemporary populations. The study of skeletal pathology has provided evidence of interpersonal violence frequency and medical knowledge development. The broader medieval context. Understanding Viking Age decline requires recognizing broader medieval transformations affecting all European societies. The consolidation of feudal political structures, expansion of Christian institutions, and development of centralized royal authority characterized medieval Europe. These transformations affected Scandinavian societies alongside other European regions. Scandinavian political consolidation and Christianization represented participation in broader medieval European development rather than unique transformation. The development of increasingly effective military technologies and tactics reduced the advantage conferred by Norse maritime expertise. By the 11th and 12th centuries, European cavalry, mounted knights, and defensive technologies had evolved beyond what Norse warriors possessed. This military evolution made Viking-style raiding less militarily advantageous. Simultaneously, maritime technology development in Mediterranean and Atlantic contexts challenged Norse maritime dominance. The development of feudal political structures in Scandinavia represented integration into European political systems rather than external conquest. Scandinavian rulers, operating within feudal frameworks, competed for power and territory using medieval political and military instruments. The transition represented evolutionary development within broader medieval context rather than fundamental cultural replacement. The Varangian Guard's persistence. While Western Viking expansion contracted significantly after the mid-10th century and raiding declined by the 11th century, the Varangian Guard persisted in Constantinople into the 13th century, exemplifying the integration of Norse military traditions into established medieval institutions. The Guard, initially composed of Norse and Scandinavian warriors, gradually incorporated other northern populations, including Anglo-Saxons, following the Norman conquest of England. This gradual evolution illustrates the transformation of Viking-era warrior traditions into medieval institutional arrangements. The Guard's institutional persistence and eventual incorporation into broader Byzantine military structures represents successful integration of external warrior populations into established systems. By the 12th century, Varangian service represented career military path within established imperial hierarchy rather than independent warrior venture. This transformation exemplifies patterns visible across Scandinavian societies. Integration of Viking-era institutions and personnel into medieval frameworks rather than abrupt termination. The complex legacy of the Viking Age. The end of the Viking Age represented neither sudden catastrophe nor complete cultural replacement. Rather, it reflected gradual transformation and integration of Scandinavian societies into medieval European political, economic, and cultural structures. Scandinavian populations persisted, but their political organization, religious orientation, and cultural expression transformed substantially. The warrior merchant societies of the Viking Age evolved into feudal kingdoms, participating in Christian European systems. This transformation was neither inevitable nor uniform across all Scandinavian regions. Iceland, maintaining geographic isolation, preserved greater cultural continuity. Greenland eventually faced unsustainable conditions necessitating abandonment. Scandinavian populations integrated at varying rates, with coastal regions incorporating Christian European institutions earlier than interior populations. Some Scandinavian cultural elements persisted, transformed, or disappeared, while others were gradually adopted from Christian European cultures. The legacy of the Viking Age extends beyond political transformation or military achievement. Linguistic influences, genetic admixture, and cultural contributions shaped medieval European development. Scandinavian artistic traditions, literary practices, and maritime expertise influenced medieval European culture, even as Scandinavian societies themselves transformed. Understanding this legacy requires recognizing both the genuine achievements of Viking Age societies and the extent to which subsequent development integrated, rather than rejected, Viking Age heritage. Conclusion. Historical understanding beyond myth. Accurate historical understanding of Vikings requires moving beyond both sensationalized warrior mythology and reactive academic minimization of genuine Viking Age significance. Vikings were sophisticated medieval populations with complex societies, extensive commercial networks, advanced maritime technology, and significant cultural achievements. They were also raiders, enslavers, and participants in warfare. But so were their contemporaries throughout medieval Europe. The Viking Age, as historical period, represents neither the beginning nor ending of Scandinavian history. Rather, it constitutes a distinctive phase in European medieval development characterized by particular geopolitical circumstances, technological advantages, and expansionist impulses. The subsequent integration of Scandinavian societies into medieval European structures represents natural historical progression rather than cultural defeat or vindication. Understanding Vikings requires historical evidence-based analysis, examining archaeological remains, analyzing textual sources critically, recognizing historiographic biases, and integrating multiple evidence types. This approach reveals complex societies worthy of serious historical attention while rejecting both romanticization and dismissal. The Viking Age represents significant medieval European historical period, illuminating fundamental aspects of medieval society, warfare, commerce, and cultural development. Its proper historical understanding contributes to sophisticated comprehension of medieval European history while revealing the remarkable adaptability, mobility, and integration capacity of Viking Age populations within broader medieval contexts.